She paid for a man's coffee in line, not knowing he was a disguised millionaire testing real kindness. The bell above the door jingled as Claire stepped into the cafe, her boots dripping onto the worn tile floor. The scent of espresso and warm pastries hit her like a lullaby, familiar, comforting, and just out of reach. Outside, the rain poured down in cold, unrelenting sheets, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. She pulled her coat tighter around her. It was an old coat, 2 sizes too big, the lining torn at the wrists, but it was hers. She moved to the end of the line, clutching the last $5 she had in the world. Enough for a small coffee. Not enough for rent, not enough for tomorrow, but enough for now. The cafe was modest, the kind that smelled like cinnamon and exhaustion. The line was slow. Her stomach rumbled. In front of her stood a man who looked like he belonged somewhere else. His gray coat hung limp on his tall frame, soaked through. His shoes were scuffed, his posture hunched, as if he carried more than just the weight of the rain. She noticed his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his wallet. The cashier, young, chewing gum, looked unimpressed. "That'll be $4.65, she said flatly. The man stared down at his open wallet. I thought I had more," he fumbled, pulling out coins. Maybe I dropped a bill. I was sure." There was a pause, uncomfortable, the kind that stretched wider than time. A woman behind Claire muttered, "Some people just waste everyone's time." Claire looked at him. His shoulders sagged with embarrassment. His voice had a slight rasp, the sound of someone not used to asking for help. The cashier sighed. "Sir, do you have a card?" I must have left it at home," he said softly. Claire didn't think. She didn't calculate what that coffee might cost her later. She didn't weigh her options. Her voice rose, clear and certain. "It's okay. I'll pay for his coffee." The line went still. The cashier blinked. "You? What?" Claire stepped forward, pulling out her crumpled bill. "I said I'll pay for it. Just the coffee." The man turned slowly to face her. His eyes, dark, tired, met hers with an expression she couldn't quite name. Surprise, certainly, but something else, too. Something like wonder. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Claire replied. She handed over the bill. The cashier rang it up. No one clapped, no one thanked her. Someone behind her sighed, annoyed at the delay. The man accepted the paper cup with a quiet, "Thank you," to the barista. Then he looked at Claire again, this time more deeply. "Thank you," he said once more, but slower, deliberate. "That means more than you think." She gave a small shrug. "It's just coffee." He smiled, but it wasn't a casual smile. It was the kind that carried years. Then he nodded once and stepped toward the exit. The door chimed again as he left, vanishing into the gray. Claire ordered nothing for herself. She had no money left now. But she didn't feel hollow. Somehow she felt full. She sat down at a corner table, warming her hands on the sleeve of her coat. The rain outside kept falling, tapping softly against the glass like a whisper she couldn't yet understand. Claire's apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and damp drywall. It was the scent of something that had once been warm, cozy, lived in, now thinned out by time and neglect. The kind of place that creaked when you walked, sighed when you sat down, and held on to smells longer than it held on to hope. It was a small space, just one room above an old laundromat where the machines ran late into the night. The radiator in the corner rattled like it was trying to cough itself awake, and the window above the sink never quite shut, letting in a cold draft that whispered through the cracked paint. The wallpaper peeled like it had tried to leave and been talked out of it. The ceiling bore the stain of a leak no one remembered reporting. But it was home, at least it had been. The eviction notice was still pinned crookedly to the doorframe, fluttering with every gust of wind that slipped through the gap. Claire had read it twice, once with disbelief and once just to make sure the date hadn't somehow changed. 3 days. Maybe 4 if the landlord forgot or found a softer mood. But Claire knew better than to hope for mercy. The world had been tight-fisted with grace lately. She dropped her canvas tote onto the floor where it slumped like a tired friend. Her shoes came off with 2 quiet thuds, and the linoleum floor sent a chill through the threadbare socks she wore too many days in a row. She hadn't eaten since noon. There wasn't much to eat anyway. A bag of rice, a can of soup she was saving for a colder night. She hadn't bought groceries in a week, not since the diner let her go. Budget cuts, the manager said. Low sales, less traffic since the highway construction. It's nothing personal, Claire. But it always felt personal when your name was the one erased from the schedule. When your apron hung alone, not taken home, just left behind, as if that version of you no longer belonged. She'd applied everywhere since, gas stations, corner shops, a bakery uptown that said she was too timid for the customer-facing role. She even interviewed at a self-health storage facility where the manager asked, "Can you smile less nervously?" as if confidence was something that could be turned up like a dial. No one called back. The electricity bill had doubled the month before because the radiator failed, and she had run a space heater for a week to keep the cold from settling into her bones. That morning, the power company had called again. "Ms. Langdon, this is your 3rd and final notice. If the balance isn't paid in 72 hours, we'll proceed with service interruption." "I understand," Claire had replied. She always did. That night, instead of light, she lit the stub of a candle. Instead of dinner, she boiled water for pasta she didn't have, then turned off the burner and watched the steam rise like a small ghost. Then, as she always did when the world felt like it was pressing too hard on her chest, she reached for her journal. It was the only thing she had kept from childhood. The leather cover was soft and cracked at the edges, the pages warped from too much ink, too many teardrops. Inside were her old dreams, floor plans for the bakery she once sketched in the back of her textbooks, lists of ingredients she had never been able to afford, names of fictional pastries that she swore she'd bake someday. Now, it mostly held quiet prayers. Still, Claire opened to a new page, dated the top corner in soft cursive. November 3rd. She began to write. "Today I bought coffee for a stranger. I almost didn't. I don't know why I did, maybe because I saw something in his eyes that felt like mine, like the world was a little too loud and too heavy. He said thank you like it mattered. I think that was enough. Maybe that will be the only good thing I do this week. Maybe that's okay." She stared at the words. They looked small, fragile, but they were real, and sometimes real was all she had. Claire closed the journal slowly and tucked it beneath her pillow, as she had every night since she was 12. That way, if the night got too heavy, she'd remember who she still was beneath all the not enough. She curled up beneath the thin blanket, pulling it to her chin. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. Inside, in the flickering candlelight, a girl with no job, no heat, and no clear future had still chosen to give. And in a world so hungry for more, maybe, just maybe, that was everything. Claire did not expect to see him again. But there he was, same coat, though less soaked this time. Same tired eyes, though now they held something sharper, more focused. He stood at the edge of the cafe, watching her, not with the unease of a stranger, but the weight of someone who had remembered something too long to forget. Claire had come back that morning not for coffee, she had no money left, but to check the community bulletin board near the restroom. Sometimes there were ads for part-time jobs, dog walking, cleaning houses, babysitting, anything. She was scanning the board when she heard a voice behind her. Still looking for something? She turned quickly. It was him, the man whose coffee she had paid for, dressed a little neater now, though his boots were still scuffed. He smiled, almost shyly. "You again?" Claire said cautiously. "Still without a wallet?" He laughed, a low, pleasant sound. "No, fully equipped today, just figured I'd try to return the favor." Claire narrowed her eyes. "I didn't do it for a favor." "I know," he said softly. "That's why it meant something." There was a pause. Claire studied him more closely now. He didn't look like someone who belonged to this neighborhood. His speech was too careful, his posture too composed. "Who are you?" she asked. He extended a hand. "Tom," he said. "I'm a freelance writer, Independent journalist, I guess. I write human stories, real ones." Claire didn't shake his hand. "A writer," she repeated, skeptical. "I'm looking for a story," he said, "and I think you might have one." Claire crossed her arms. "Why would I be a story?" "Because you paid for someone's coffee when you could barely afford your own, because you didn't expect thanks, because you didn't know anyone was watching, but I was." She said nothing. Tom James really continued. "Look, I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I'd like to hear more. About you, if you'd be willing." Claire hesitated. Something about him didn't sit quite right, but also something about him didn't feel wrong. "All right," she said. "You can ask." They sat by the window, sunlight slicing through the smudged glass in pale streaks. James pulled out a notebook, not the expensive leather-bound kind, just a simple one with worn edges. He didn't start asking questions right away. Instead, he asked for her name. She gave it. Then he asked about the bakery drawing he had noticed tucked inside her notebook when she'd opened it briefly to jot something down. Claire blinked. "You saw that?" "I noticed details, occupational hazard." So she told him. About the bakery. About the almond croissants her grandmother used to make every Saturday. About the dream she'd had since high school to open a place called Sugar and Light. About saving up every tip she earned. About watching the money slowly disappear again, because dreams cost more than rent ever did. James did not interrupt. He just listened. His pen moved occasionally, but mostly he looked at her like she was not just a voice, but a person, with weight, with worth. When they parted ways that day, he said, "Maybe we'll talk again, if you want to." Claire shrugged. "Sure. Doesn't cost anything to talk." But as he walked out of the cafe, something fluttered inside her. He had returned, and he had looked at her like she mattered. She didn't know yet that his real name was James Rowan, that he had written 7 best-selling novels, that his photo had once graced the cover of The New Yorker, that he had disappeared from the public eye 2 years earlier after announcing he'd never write again unless he found a story worth the silence he'd endured. She didn't know she was that story. Not yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire and Tom fell into a quiet, almost accidental rhythm. They never planned their meetings. Some days they crossed paths at the cafe, other times in the little park down the street where pigeons danced around children's feet and the wind carried the smell of street pretzels and fallen leaves. It was always casual, always easy, but it began to feel like a pattern stitched into her days, a presence she didn't realize she'd begun to look for until it was already there. Claire would talk, and James, still Tom to her, would listen. Not just the polite kind of listening people offered out of manners, but the deep, focused kind that made her feel like her words had weight. He scribbled in a worn-down notebook with a pencil that always seemed nearly out of lead, his head tilted slightly, brows furrowed in concentration. For maybe the first time in her life, Claire believed her story mattered. She told him things she never said aloud, about how she used to bake cupcakes with her grandmother every Sunday morning, flour everywhere, her tiny hands barely big enough to hold the whisk, about how she'd once believed, truly believed, she'd have her own cafe by now. She even admitted how many nights she spent sketching logos, drafting menus, designing warm spaces full of mismatched chairs and cinnamon-scented windows. But then she told him the other things, too, about the slow unraveling of that dream, how it came undone not in a single storm, but in the slow erosion of job rejections, utility bills, and quiet loneliness, one disappointment at a time, until all she had left was a journal under her pillow, and a heart that still hoped, though it had no business doing so. "I don't know why I still believe people are good," she said once, tracing a finger along the grain of the park bench. He had smiled at her then, not with pity, but with reverence. "Because you are." Their time together became its own kind of sanctuary. Sometimes they barely spoke. They'd walk together for blocks, letting silence speak what words could not. And sometimes she'd brought him muffins, barely held together with borrowed ingredients and hope. He would take a bite, close his eyes, and hum like he was tasting a memory. It made her laugh every time. She felt real again, like more than a problem to solve, like more than a statistic with an overdue notice, like someone whose presence wasn't a burden but a gift, until the day it all fell apart. It started innocently, like most betrayals do. Claire had wandered into the used bookstore on 9th Avenue, escaping the drizzle and the tightness in her chest. She loved the place, with its crooked aisles and chairs that sank too low. She wasn't planning to buy anything. She just liked the smell of old paper and the quiet. She was skimming through the new releases shelf more out of habit than hope when she saw it. A face. Familiar. Dark eyes, the same quiet smile. She froze. Her heart kicked up. Her hands turned cold. The back of the dust jacket read, James Rowan. A name she hadn't heard in years, but one the literary world still revered. Best-selling author, reclusive genius, vanished from the spotlight after his 7th novel, famously declaring he had nothing left to say. Until now, Claire stared at the photo. She didn't need to check it twice. It was him. Not Tom, James. She left the bookstore in a daze. Back at her apartment, she tore through the scribbled notes he had left in their shared coffee shop napkins and loose pages. Bits of her life stared back at her in ink, phrases she thought had passed between them privately, thoughts she hadn't said to anyone else. And they were all there, word for word. The next morning, she found him at their usual bench in the park, notebook open on his lap. He looked up, expecting a smile. She didn't sit. Your name's not Tom, she said, each word cold, flat. James blinked. Claire, James Rowan, she cut in, author, recluse, liar. He stood, slowly. Please, you've been writing about me, she snapped. You took my life, my story, and turned it into one of your emotional little parables, didn't you? It's not like that, he said, voice strained. I didn't mean, are you writing a book? She demanded. He hesitated, then nodded, just once. Her voice cracked. So I'm just another broken girl in your masterpiece? Another sob story to make readers feel noble for a few pages? No, he said, stepping forward. You're the reason I started writing again. Because you're brave. Because you gave when you had nothing left. You made me believe again. She stepped back, her eyes burning. I helped a man, she said bitterly. Not a millionaire, not a famous author, just a man who looked cold and lost. James swallowed hard. And I was that man. No, she whispered. You were a test, and I didn't even know I was being tested. He reached out. Claire? I turned it into hope, but she was already walking away. The rain began to fall, slow, steady, soaking through her sleeves. She pulled her coat tighter, trying to hold herself together. The betrayal hurt, not because he was famous. It hurt because he had seen her, and then used her. James stood motionless, letting the rain soak through his pages, watching the woman who had saved him walk away from him. This time, because of him. The envelope was plain, no name on the front, just Claire, written in careful, slanted handwriting. It was tucked beneath the welcome mat outside her apartment door, just barely visible, as if it did not want to be found unless she truly meant to look. Claire spotted it on her way in, soaked from the drizzle that had lingered all morning. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. She knew who it was from before she opened it. She closed the door behind her, sank into the small chair by the window, and unfolded the letter with trembling hands. It read, Claire, I told you stories were everything to me. That was not true. For a long time I thought the world didn't need another one, not after everything I had written, not after the words began to sound empty to my own ears. But then I met you. I thought I was watching a moment of kindness from a stranger. What I did not know was that I had stumbled upon the story I never expected to find again, one I did not have to write to believe. I never intended to make you a character. You were never that. You weren't part of my story. You became it. I wanted to show you. That's why I left the manuscript. No publishing house has seen it. No editor, no press, only you. If you never want to speak to me again, I will understand, but I needed you to know. You changed me. I only hope somehow I gave something back. Claire held the pages in her lap for a long time. Her breath caught in her throat. He had included the manuscript. She looked at it with quiet dread and curiosity. The title was handwritten on the first page, "The Girl with No Reason Left But Still Chose to Give." She flipped to the first chapter. It began with a cafe, a small act of kindness. A girl who offered her last $5 not because she had any to spare, but because someone else had none at all. Each page was her story, not in facts and bullet points, but in feeling, the way she looked at the world when no one else was watching, the quiet strength she carried like a second skin, her laugh, her tears, her dreams about a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. But it was not pitiful, it was reverent. James had written about her the way someone writes about the moon, not just because it glows, but because it glows even when no one's looking. Claire turned to a page near the middle, where James described watching her help a child tie their shoelaces outside the park. She spoke gently, like the world had hurt her, but she still hoped it could be kind. "I didn't know what I was looking for, until I saw her do that. Something no one would write about, and that's when I knew I wanted to write about her." Claire wiped her face, realizing she had been crying quietly. And yet it was not the kind of crying she had known in recent months, not the tears of frustration or loneliness or hunger. This was something else, something lighter. Someone had seen her, not for what she lacked, not for what she struggled through, but for what she gave, freely, with no promise of return. She closed the manuscript slowly, ends resting on the cover. A knock came at the door. She froze. Then she stood, walked over, and opened it. There was no one there. Just the faint scent of rain, and somewhere down the street footsteps fading into the quiet. Claire looked at the sky, and for the first time in what felt like years, she smiled. Claire had walked 4 blocks, past where she meant to turn, twice. Her fingers were curled tightly around the manuscript, now softened at the corners from being read and reread. Rain tapped lightly on the sleeve of her jacket, and the wind carried the early breath of winter. She was not sure what made her go. Maybe it was the way he wrote about her. Maybe it was the silence in her apartment, too loud now with the truth of being seen. Or maybe it was just this. She had spent her life giving to people who never remembered her name. James had remembered everything. She reached the address printed faintly on the back of the envelope. It was a quiet townhouse on a narrow, tree-lined street. Ivy curled along the iron gate, and a flicker of warm light glowed behind the windows. She stood there for a moment, unsure, then stepped forward and rang the bell. No answer. But the door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pushed it open. The scent hit her first. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a faint trace of brown sugar melting in butter. She stepped into a modest kitchen, lined with shelves of old cookbooks, and 2 chipped mugs on the table. At the stove stood James, no longer the mysterious stranger, no longer the author with something to hide, wearing a flour-dusted apron and staring at the oven timer like it might judge him. He turned, saw her, and he smiled, just slightly, not with relief or triumph, but something softer, like forgiveness. "You're here," he said. She didn't speak. He gestured to the counter. "I tried your grandmother's pecan bread recipe. You once said she measured love by the pinch, not the cup." Claire raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "And you remembered?" "I remembered everything," James said. They sat at the kitchen table, 2 warm slices on mismatched plates. The silence between them no longer sharp but comfortable, like a quilt stretched across something old and aching. They ate slowly. He looked up. "No more lies," James said. "You taught me enough truth." Claire met his eyes. "I didn't mean to be your story." "King Boozy," she said. "You weren't," he replied. "You were the reason I started telling one again." She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. After a long pause, she reached into her coat and placed the manuscript on the table. "I want to help finish it." He blinked. "You do?" "But not just about me," she said. "There are so many people like me, women who give their last $5, men who hold doors open in the rain, children who share half their lunch, "We write their stories," James leaned back. "Ordinary people with extraordinary hearts," he said. Claire nodded. "We remind the world they exist." And just like that, the girl who once had nothing, and the man who once had everything but felt empty, decided to build something that neither of them could do alone. Not out of guilt, not out of rescue, but out of respect. Out of something dangerously close to love. They clinked mugs that night, not to endings, not to beginnings, but to the quiet, slow middle where two lives begin to weave into one. No more lies, just truth. And words. Together. The book hit the shelves on the first Tuesday of spring. It arrived without much fanfare. No celebrity launch party, no exclusive reviews from the literary elite, just a quiet arrival at independent bookstores, library shelves, and local cafes where kindness was still served beside a hot drink. Its title was modest. Kindness, even broke. And beneath the title, in equally unembellished type, by Claire Langdon and James Rowan, to the world the names together raised eyebrows. A best-selling author returned from years of silence, and a girl no one had ever heard of before. The curiosity sold copies, but the story inside is what made people stay. The book wasn't just about Claire. It wasn't even just about kindness. It was about choosing to care when the world gave you every excuse not to. The first chapter told of a rainy morning, a $5 bill, and a girl who gave what she could not afford to lose. But as readers turned the pages, they found it wasn't just one act. The book was filled with stories of real people, Claire's neighbors, friends, strangers she had once passed on the street, people who gave when no one was watching. It included James's reflections, too, about watching Claire from across a coffee shop, believing he was studying her, only to discover he was learning from her. He wrote about her generosity with the reverence of a poet and the humility of someone who had almost forgotten what grace looked like. It didn't take long for the book to climb the bestseller list, not because it was flashy or clever, but because it felt like truth. Book clubs passed it around with dog-eared pages. Teachers read excerpts aloud in classrooms. Strangers left notes in copies they donated to libraries. This made me cry in the best way. You reminded me of my grandmother. I paid for someone's coffee today because of this. Claire, suddenly seen by millions, was stunned. She had never planned for any of it. Fame made her nervous, crowds drained her, but when she spoke, at libraries, schools, shelters, her voice shook less each time. "I didn't write this book to be known," she said in an early interview. "I wrote it because we needed to remember that being kind is never wasted, even when you're broke, especially then." With her share of the royalties, Claire rented a narrow corner building with a faded blue awning and peeling paint. She named it Sugar and Light, a name she had scribbled in the margins of her journal years earlier. The space was part bakery, part bookhaven. The front window steamed up each morning with the scent of warm bread, cinnamon, and sweet coffee. Inside, children read aloud from dog-eared picture books. Teenagers sat at corner tables with free cookies and paperbacks from the Take One, Keep One shelf. No one was turned away. Not for being short on money, not for being short on hope. And in the corner, almost every day, sat James. Not as an author, not as someone owed recognition, just as a man who liked watching stories unfold over warm scones and sugar-sticky hands. He had found a home, not in a mansion, not on a stage, but beside a window, near the counter where Claire wiped flour off her cheek and smiled at everyone who walked in like they were the reason she opened the door that day. To most customers, he was Mr. James, a quiet older man with a notebook always half-filled, who sipped his coffee slowly and knew the names of every child who read beside him. Occasionally, someone recognized him. "Aren't you James Rowan, the writer?" He would nod, then point to the woman behind the counter. But the story started with her. Claire kept writing, but not from a place of desperation anymore. Now she wrote in the calm between batches of muffins. She wrote about real people, ordinary ones who did beautiful, unseen things. She and James started hosting free storytelling nights every other Friday. People shared tales, some messy, some hilarious, some heartbreaking, all of them real. At one of these evenings, a child stood up and said, "My mom paid for someone's groceries last week. She said it made her heart feel bigger." Claire smiled. That was all she ever hoped for. In a world addicted to spectacle, they had built something quietly beautiful. And in the corner, beneath a sign that read, "Free coffee, no questions," James would look around at the warm lights, the shelves of stories, and the woman who once gave him $5 and never asked for anything in return, and think, this is the best chapter I've ever written. Because sometimes, the greatest story is not the one told to the world, it's the one you live, together, every day. The winter evening settled over the city like a hush. Snow fell softly, dusting the sidewalk outside Sugar and Light. Inside, the bakery glowed with warmth, the low hum of the oven, the smell of cinnamon and butter, and the soft flicker of candles lining the counter. It was after hours. Chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, but Claire moved quietly through the kitchen, placing the final touches on the cake she had been working on since noon. It was simple: vanilla sponge, light whipped cream, a swirl of caramel across the top. But it wasn't the cake that mattered. It was who it was for. James arrived right on time, just as she knew he would. He stepped in through the back door, brushing snow from his coat, eyebrows lifted in surprise at the dim lights and flickering candles. Claire stood in front of the cake, her apron dusted with flour, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Happy birthday," she said softly. James blinked. "You remembered?" "I always remember the people who remember me," she replied. He looked at the cake, then back at her. "That's the first time anyone's baked for me in over 20 years. "Well," she said, "you've earned it." They sat at the small kitchen table, just the two of them. No decorations, no crowd. Just the scent of warmth, the sound of quiet breathing, and something between them that had taken root long before either of them admitted it. James set his fork down after the first bite. "All my life," he said, "I've written about love. I've crafted it, shaped it, tried to give it language. But I think I just started to live it." Claire looked at him, eyes shimmering with something gentle and sure. "And all I ever needed," she said, "was someone who saw me as enough. Not an idea, not a cause, just me." James reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch, no box, no ribbon. Inside was a ring, thin, worn, with a pearl barely clinging to its setting. It was not new, not even shiny. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She told me to keep it until I found someone who was kind when no one was looking, who gave not to be noticed but because they couldn't help but give." He looked into Claire's eyes, his voice quieter now. She didn't say it had to be someone rich or impressive, just someone true. He held out the ring. "Claire, would you stay? Not just in this place, in this life. With me?" Claire stared at him, then smiled. "I've been staying," she whispered. "I just didn't know it had a name." She slid the ring onto her own finger. No theatrics, no grand applause. Just two hands, one truth, and a love that had grown slowly, like bread rising in silence. The next morning, the bakery opened as usual. But something was different. Children ran through the front door, giggling. The smell of fresh scones filled the air, and James sat in his usual spot by the window. Claire stood behind the counter, arranging a tray of muffins, when a little girl asked, "Miss Claire, what does that sign mean?" She pointed to the hand-painted wooden board James had hung the night before above the door, where kindness first brewed. Claire looked up at it. Her eyes softened. "It means," she said, "this place was built on something that never runs out." Outside, snowflakes danced in the light. Claire and James stood together on the steps of the bakery, her hand wrapped in his, steam curling out of paper cups in their other hands. No camera crews, no headlines, just the laughter of children running past, the warmth of a home built with stories and sugar, and the quiet miracle of two lives that had found each other not by fortune, but by faith. There were no more tests, no more disguises, Only this: a love not asked for, but freely returned. Because sometimes the richest love comes not from what you have, but from what you choose to give away. Sometimes love doesn't come wrapped in luxury or dressed in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a small kindness, a warm cup of coffee, a ring passed down through generations, and a choice to stay. Claire and James didn't find each other through fate or fairy tales. They found each other through a moment of quiet generosity. A moment that grew into trust, then into home, then into something that didn't need to be proven, because it was real. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that the smallest kindness can change everything, then we invite you to stay with us a little longer. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of compassion, redemption, and love that begins where judgment ends. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that whisper, not shout. See you in the next story.